In 1996, the South Korean government took some really drastic and unexpected steps. These steps were never taken before, and they had left the entire nation questioning the decisions. What they did was completely sealed out a hospital building, and they classified all the records that were associated with that building under the name of national security. The National Police of Korea also installed around 24-hour security around this empty hospital building, and over the next few years only a few people were able to sneak in out of curiosity, and they came back with the most horrific and extraordinary evidence of the supernatural activities that take place there. Today I am going to tell you everything I know and researched about this hospital and why this was abandoned, and the whole story about what happened when. And this story is mind-numbingly chilling, and it is one of those stories that feel very unreal, but it's happened, and here's what it is. In the spring of 1982, in the quiet province of Gyeonggi, one of this province in South Korea, a psychiatric hospital was opened, and this hospital was called the Gonjiam Psychiatric Hospital. At first, this place seemed really nice, like, it had these white walls and big windows, and sunlight was everywhere, and people who went there actually got cured. The families that brought their loved ones there went back with happy tears because this place was built in like very high standards, and people were actually getting cured. The Korean doctors, the psychiatrists who were working there, actually called this hospital the future of Korean psychiatry, because it was built to the standard of Western medical hospitals, and it was very new at the time. There were about 400 beds, spacious gardens, and this was located in a very nice, quiet countryside area. And for 6 years, this place lived up to its promise. Like I said, people were getting cured. A lot of people were employed there, right? Nurses and compounders and people who were taking care of the hospital premises. So a lot of people were employed, and things were going really, really well. Until in 1988, the first cracks appeared. There was this nurse called Kim Hae-jin. I hope I'm pronouncing her name right, but she was the first to notice the whispers. What happened was, during one of her night shifts, she heard this unison of whispers coming from the psychiatric ward. So it was more like a lot of people who are whispering or chanting a certain sentence over and over again. And the sentence that she was hearing was, she's waiting in the corridor. Or she's waiting in the hall. Something like that, And it was going on and on and on and on and on. So obviously she was a little shook, and she wanted to figure out what's happening. So she stepped into the hallway, and she went in to check on these patients. And what she saw was something horrific. She saw all of these patients who were in that ward just closing their mouth. I don't know how the sound was coming, but they were closing their mouth, and their eyes were wide open, staring dead into the dark. And those whispers continuously were running in the background. And she got absolutely freaked out, because this was the first horrific incident that had happened there, and she was not expecting it in the first place, right? So she was really, really, really scared, and she ran away from the premises. What happened in the next few months was something unexplainable, because all these patients slowly started reporting this exact thing about a woman who is dressed in white standing on the edge of the corridor. And they used to talk about it so much, with so much precision and so much accuracy, that it was almost haunting. So the doctors now needed a scientific way to prove what this is, that all these patients are reporting the same woman, say at the edge of the corridor, and why the same vision is being haunting these people. So they needed a scientific explanation to all of this. So what they did was, they termed this as shared psychosis, wherein a lot of people can actually share a particular vision. But you must notice that a shared vision is a similar kind of vision that people have seen, but it cannot be exactly as is. The accuracy of the vision should be different even in shared psychosis. But this is what Dr. Park, who was one of the main psychiatrists in the hospital, was concerned about. He started noticing that all these visions that these patients are sharing are exactly the same. The precision and the accuracy of their visions was so close that he couldn't explain it as a shared psychosis. He also started to believe that this was something supernatural because this was impossible. The most weird part in all of this is, forget about the patients who are actually in the wards. They might be talking to each other and they might be sharing this kind of vision, right? But the people or the patients who are in isolation wards where they have absolutely no human contact would also draw the exact same vision, or they would narrate this kind of vision to the staff members, which was horrific. Like, how was this happening? There was no explanation, and the hospital did not care enough to, dig further into this. So a lot of more incidents started coming up. March 15, 1991, one of the security officers on the premises, I think his name was Cho Kang-soo, he was sitting in the monitoring room. So monitoring room has a lot of screens where this person is keeping an eye on the patients, on the staff members, making sure they're all safe during the night and there is no disturbances going on around the hospital. So he was sitting there in the monitoring room and suddenly he gets all these goosebumps on his hands, on his legs, and he is so stunned at what he's seeing on screen that he was not able to move. It was almost like he was paralyzed. He was just staring at the screen with dead eye because what he was seeing was not what he was expecting. So on the screen, this guard was seeing that in corridor B, patient 247 stood barefoot. He was just standing there, staring dead into the wall, and he was doing nothing. He was not moving, he was standing in the dark. All the security guard could see was his number, 247. Now, why this shook and stunned him is because he had actually taken patient 247 to a different ward, to room 412, where he had actually sedated this patient, locked this patient up in the room, and he had come to the monitoring room. So he was the first-hand person who had taken this patient to a different room and locked him there, sedated him there, and suddenly he sees him on the screen. To make sure that the patient did not escape the room, he looked at all the footage from the room 412, and you wouldn't believe that there was no break in the feed. No one entered or left a room 412, and yet patient 247 was at two places at once. This footage was actually submitted to the hospital because this is absolute paranormal experience, right? And this was submitted to the hospital, and the worst thing is that no explanation came from the hospital. There was no follow-up done, and this incident was buried amongst many more such incidences. On August 3rd, 1992, another such incident that was again very creepy followed, where three separate cameras of ward 2, 3 and 4 caught the same figure, the figure of that woman, just crossing doors and walls and walking through the corridors. Now this was a solid figure of that woman, and it did not need to open doors or whatever. It would just walk through walls, and that is what scared people like hell, because it's absolutely impossible for a human to do it. It is not humanly possible for anyone to do such an activity. So this was also one of those incidents that got buried. Please note that the time when all these incidents were happening were between 2 o'clock and 4 o'clock. So the first incident what I talked about happened at around 2:17 a.m. and the second incident with the woman floating around happened at 3:33 a.m. which is all during ghost hour. After several such incidents, the staff found it almost impossible to work night shifts. I mean, their life is more important than getting paid, right? So they were not ready to work night shifts, and day shifts were not great either. These incidents used to happen during the daytime as well, but night shifts used to be even more creepy because they were in this countryside where there is absolutely no sounds and all these weird things are happening. They don't know if they're going to live to see another day, and this was too much for them today. In 1993, the staff had reached a breaking point, and they were quitting their jobs left, right and center. The nurses had gossips about whispers being heard across the hallways. Some of the parts of patients' rooms used to be so cold, in dead summer. It used to be so cold that they would need a jacket. These things were absolutely unexplainable, and there was no explanation to it other than it being paranormal. the staff started calling the night shift as fear shift. So this actually was revealed by Nurse Kim, who was the first nurse I talked about who encountered the first incident. She was actually in an interview in 2010 where she talked about this, and she said that at midnight sometimes they could actually see that woman, the woman in white, at the edge of the corridor just staring at them. And that was very, very, very creepy for people to continue working there, and that's why people were quitting. Despite so much disruption and disturbances throughout the hospital still stayed functional because they chose to bury a lot of these incidences because it would hamper with their reputations. This is why they buried like n number of such incidences. On October 13th, 1994, again at around 3:40 a.m., every alarm in the hospital rang. There was nobody ringing them. It just rang out of nowhere. 14 patients stepped out of their rooms as if they were sleepwalking, and they were barefoot in their hospital gowns. It is like cool outside, and yet they are just walking like they are, keyed by someone from the back, like as if they are toys or like robots on autopilot. They're just walking unanimously to the hall, which is in the center of the hospital, where the reception is, and they stand in 2 rows of 7s, like 7 people in the first row and 7 people in the second row, and they're just standing there. The hospital staff was terrified at this because they're standing there, not speaking, not moving. They're just looking straight ahead, dead in their eyes, as if they're following someone, or they're like those mice in the Peter Pan movie. They're just following someone and they're standing there. So the doctor, the chief psychiatrist, that's Dr. Park, he runs and comes to this hall, and then he looks at them and he's terrified, like what's happening. So he starts screaming at them, like, what are you guys doing, and what's all this, like stop doing that right now, go back to your rooms. And he's like yelling and screaming at them. And at 3:59 a.m. exactly, all of them just collapsed. All the patients collapsed in front of Dr. Park, in front of all the hospital staff. They absolutely just collapsed. There was no heartbeat, no trauma, no poison, nothing. There was absolutely no stimulus for them to, collapse like that to the ground. But it happened, and everybody was just staring at this because this was something that had a lot of eyewitnesses now. Weeks later, when investigators were studying like why this happened, this was like a mass death that had happened in the hospital. So there was a lot of investigation going on, and in the belongings of those patients who collapsed and died, they found sketches sometimes of like the 17 people standing. So they found sketches of the exact incident that happened. They could see the actual hall or the lobby where like all these people are standing in rows. But the one thing that stood out was that in front of those 14 people was a lady who was standing right in the center. It was almost like they were following her there. So all these sketches and notes that they found while they were investigating this actually made it quite clear that this hospital was suffering from like a huge paranormal trauma, and it's time for them to shut down. But as usual, this incident was also buried. I don't know how they did it. I don't know how can a mass death like this be buried, but it happened. They buried it, and the final straw came on April 7th, 1995. This incident, which happened on April 7th, 1995, was the reason that Gonjiam shut down forever, because nothing like this had ever happened before. It was a rainy day that day, and there was approximately 73 patients and 17 staffs that were working that day, right? And the patient number and the staff number had reduced drastically. Before, there used to be a lot more patients and a lot more staff working at the hospital, but because of all the activities and all the incidents that were happening, the staff had to leave, and the patients were also not many. So 73 patients, approximately 17 staff members, say around 100 people were at the hospital that day, and they were working through the night, like the staff was working through the night, and nothing happened, like nothing was reported that night. Everything was fine, everything was business as usual. But when the morning staff came in at 7 a.m., they opened the doors. The hospital was dead silent. There was nobody in the hospital, not the staff, not the patient, nobody. The hospital was completely isolated. It was almost like everybody just packed their bags and left. But what this morning staff saw was trays of food that were not touched, A lot of medicines were put in like small labeled cups, but nobody ate them. The beds were warm, almost like people were just sleeping in there, maybe would have got up and gone, right? It was just that every patient, every staff member, every doctor was just gone. There was approximately 100 people there and 100 people went absconding. There was no explanation to it. And that was the end of it. That was the end of Gonjiam, because this is not something that can be buried. This is not something that can be hidden. So this came to light. Actually, there is another theory for this whole incident. They say that when the morning staff arrived, they saw that all those 100 people were actually gruesomely killed. They were dead and their bodies were there in the hospital, which is why it got a lot of traction and which is why the authorities had to shut down the hospital. But that's just another theory. I don't know if that happened. So we actually don't know exactly what happened. Maybe one of those two things happened and the hospital closed down forever. Because this was an incident that could not be overlooked, the government actually like assigned everybody to this case. Like there was police there was army there were scientists. Everybody who could be of help were there figuring out what happened. And at that time they found very interesting few things. Like for example, in the hospital there were 3 levels of basement which were recorded as part of the blueprint. So in the hospital blueprint there are 3 basement levels, but when the authorities came there and they started investigating, they found out there were 4 more levels under the 3 basement levels, 7 basement levels, among which 4 of them were not even recorded. So what was going on in there that they were not recorded? You would not believe that when the investigators were figuring out why those basements were there and why those basements were not recorded in any kind of blueprints is because they found something horrific in those basements. Especially in basement 7, room number 23, which was called B723, investigators found 127, not 1, not 2, not 10, 127 preserved bodies. Some of these bodies were still connected to some strange machines. They were, cuffed by leather straps. They could also see some glass domes. It was almost like there were some kind of experiments going on there, but 127 bodies were discovered in this basement. Also in these basement areas, they found files in Japanese with detailed experiments dated back to like colonial times, where attempts were made, it seems, according to the notes that they found of these experiments. The attempts were made to separate the human consciousness from the human body to prove that human souls exist. Can you believe that? It is from so many years ago, where human experiments were conducted in order to prove that human souls exist. So 127 people were found there, right, preserved in death, where they were experimented to find out if human souls exist. And this is 127 people were found. God knows how many people have died there in those basements. But this was one of those incidents that the police could not overlook. This had to be recorded. This had to be part of the investigation. This had to be part of the report of the investigation. And hence, Gonjiam was forever closed. You might think that this is the end of it, but you're wrong. When the investigators found out all of this, obviously guards were stationed at that place for 24 hours a day to guard an empty building, right? A lot of people were curious to see what is happening there. And as long as people knew, from 1996 the hospital was completely shut down. There was no operations going on there. It was not at all operational by any means. However, people who were living in that neighborhood, they told a different story. They said that they could see the lights turning on some floors. They could see that nurses are making they're making rounds at the ward. They also said that they could sometimes hear like alarms going off, or they said that we could like see faces in the windows, almost like there are people there who are in the psychiatric ward. But funnily, the whole place was shut down and nothing was operational. So what was happening in the building? I guess we'll never know. But people who were living in the 2-mile radius of the hospital were starting to get affected by this whole thing. Therefore, by the whole thing, they suffered the same dreams that the patients used to suffer. They started seeing white rooms. they started seeing like a lot of fluorescent lights, flickering lights. They were feeling like they are in the hospital, they are, on the bed, and they could feel like somebody is like hovering over them, asking them all kind of psychiatric questions. And they could just feel like they are the patients. They used to feel like there are some voices in their head. They used to sometimes narrate stories of the hospital staff or even the patients, like as if they have met them or they've spoken to them, while in real life they don't even know that those people exist. So soon this was called the Gonjiam disease. So people were probably getting so affected by the negativity of that area that they were also getting all these visions and the dreams, and it was endless. So the government had to actively evacuate a 5-mile or a 2-mile, I don't remember, 2 or 5-mile radius around the hospital, and they had to set up a perimeter where soldiers would patrol the perimeter, right? And the hospital itself was, completely off limits. Nobody was supposed to go there. Nobody was supposed to enter inside the perimeter if they, want to live, basically. But even then, a lot of people were curious, and they used to go there and do some investigations and whatnot, and they have had a lot of experiences that they have recorded on camera. And there is, I think, also a movie that has been inspired from all these incidences. You must see that. It's called the Gonjiam Asylum, I think. I will put that in the description below. But this kept happening a lot, and so the exclusion zone kind of now stretches like 4 or 5 miles around the hospital, and nobody is allowed to go in there. So if you ever go to South Korea, or you are just considering visiting the place, please don't go to places like these where the government themselves have restricted it, because those restrictions are in place for a reason, and the exclusion zones exist because of the negative energy in the area. So don't expose yourself to that. So some places accumulate so much human suffering that they become dangerous for human consciousness, human physical body even to exist. And Gonjiam Hospital, or the asylum, is one of those places, unfortunately, and they continue to affect people who live there or who attempt to go there, right? So the dead of the Gonjiam, they aren't at rest. I feel like they're not even alone. I hope you liked this story. If you did, do like, share and subscribe to this channel. We have many more such stories that we have researched, put together for your curiosity. So yeah, have a nice day. Bye bye.